If you let me ramble on enough about finance, you're going to hear me say the words or something to the effect of gross margin is my preferred financial metric to pay attention to. Usually it's the most important one to understand how profitable or not your company is going to be, especially in the MSP space. Because if you deliver a good gross margin, you're almost certain to get a good EBITDA. Gross margin is one of those topics that's so important that I've actually recorded a previous video about it. I'll throw the link up above, but I'm going to get into it a little bit deeper today. Consider this sort of like gross margin part 2. And I'm going to talk about a number of different ways that you can impact gross margin positively in your business, because I think it's a really important thing to focus on. My name is Adam Hanneman. Welcome to Ramblings of a Geek. I've been in the MSP space for the better part of a couple decades, and I spent a large portion of my last 10 or so years learning about finance, learning about how to kind of run the business side of things. And this topic is near and dear to my heart. So we're going to get into all things gross margin today. Now, thinking about gross margin at a high level, we need to make sure that we're on the same page. So let's talk about what gross margin is for just a moment. Gross margin at its core component is revenue minus COGS, right? So you take your revenue minus the cost of goods sold, all the stuff that it takes to generate that revenue, and that gets you a number. And that number happens to be a dollar figure, and that tells you kind of the raw dollars that it's available to then spend below the line on things. Now, I'm talking about terms and things that will actually be more answered in my financial video. So I'll drop the financial, kind of the business finance 101 video up above. And the idea, though, is that when you take that revenue, subtract out your COGS, it gets you a dollar figure. The problem is that dollar figure doesn't give you the full picture. Really, what you need to understand is that how the dollar figure translates to the amount of money that you're making. Because as you grow your business, as you add more clients, that dollar figure should go up. But is that dollar figure going up at the same rate or at a faster rate or maybe at a slower rate than it was before, right? The idea is you want to understand if you're growing more efficiently or not. So we actually do an additional calculation. So we take that dollar figure, right, that gross margin dollar figure, and divide that back by the revenue again, multiply that by 100, and that gets you a percentage. When you get that percentage, that tells you really all about how you're doing. And you can use that number to compare yourself against yourself. But you can also use that to compare yourself against others, whether it's part of a peer group, whether it's just other benchmarking things, or just having conversations with other business owners. It's really important to understand kind of how these things work together. Now, in the MSP space, we actually have a number of different areas of gross margin that we pay attention to, because we like to understand a hardware gross margin, and we like to understand our cloud gross margin, like what we get out of our fixed fee pieces as it relates to all the different tools that we sell. We also really pay attention to the service gross margin. Now, for the remainder of our conversation today, service gross margin is really going to be what I'm going to talk about, because it's an important thing to think about and to kind of and work to move that in the right direction. Because most MSPs generate most of the revenue from service, it's important that we really pay attention to the service side of the world. There's lots of different things you can do to generate more service gross margin. Now, service gross margin is just a nuanced calculation for all things gross margin, right? Where you take your services revenue, you subtract your services COGS, and that includes things like your technician salaries and tools and those kinds of things, and that gets you that dollar figure, right? That's services gross margin dollars. Well, then you take that service gross margin dollars, divide it back by your service revenue, and multiply that by 100, and that gets you a service gross margin percent. Now, I think it's important that we think about that as we talk about the rest of our video today. So let's talk about one of the first ways I think is important to manage your service gross margin. It's all about pricing. Now, when you think about pricing your agreements, you need to make sure that you're baking margin in across the board, right? If you aren't pricing agreements to the right level, you could just be bleeding margin out just based on just signing a new client, right? You actually might sign a new client that actually is net negative for your business, at least from a percentage basis. So it's important to think about that when you build your pricing. I'll actually link my pricing video up above, and I'm also working on a new pricing video with a calculator and stuff that you can use in your own business as well. So that's all coming here soon. So when that's available, I'll actually change the link above to the new video. But the idea here is that you need to build your pricing with your margin baked in. If you don't do that, what you'll find is you will make less margin almost certainly. Most MSPs that I talk to will ask me a version of the question is, hey, am I charging enough or not? And almost always, I mean, like 99% of the time, the answer is no, you're not charging enough. I think at this point, if you aren't charging at least $150 an hour, no matter what market you're in, no matter where you are in the US, I think you're leaving some money on the table. I actually think your hourly rate should be closer to $175 to $200 an hour in most cases, and especially when you are doing like bigger brain stuff for your clients, right? So think about doing projects, doing like higher level consulting, doing things with AI, doing things, anything that along the lines of like what we might call digital transformation, where you're actually like becoming a little bit of a consultant inside your clients' businesses. If you're doing that kind of stuff and you're paying somebody a couple $100,000 a year, $150,000 a year, or something like that, those rates need to move up. You can't charge $125 an hour and pay somebody, $150,000 a year. It just isn't going to work. You're gonna be bleeding margin left and right. So you need to make sure that you're doing that well, and you're keeping those people busy too, because that's a really important piece. A little bit, we'll talk about efficiency here in a little bit. But let's think about pricing as I got to make sure I'm charging the right amount for delivering the service. And the only way to do that is to pay attention to your financials, which is what we're talking about today. All right, so we talk about revenue. Revenue is important. So make sure that your prices are where they need to be. And if they're not, then it's time to start working on it. Raising your prices, all those kind of things, it really isn't that big of a deal. I'll actually link a video up above about raising prices. More often than not, like almost all your clients are going to go, yeah, okay, this is part of the deal, moving on. Every once in a while, you'll have a client that gets a little bit ornery about it, but usually you don't lose too many clients, if any, and by and large, the amount that you've raised your prices elsewhere will more than cover a client or two that might eventually eject because of pricing increases. If you are getting value out of this video, please do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment on how gross margin is impacting your business and some things that you've learned or are doing to move your gross margin up. I'd love to have a conversation with you, and the interaction really does help my YouTube stats. Moving on from pricing, let's talk a little bit about paying your people, because I think there's a couple things that you need to pay attention to. One, you need to pay your staff something that is a good salary. Like you need to not underpay your people, because you don't want to race to the bottom here, because when you race to the bottom, you're going to get bottom of the barrel people that work for you, and that's not a thing you want. You want your MSP to be a place where people want to work. So you have to pay them a reasonable salary. But one of the things I see all the time, or at least frequently enough to comment on, is that MSPs frequently don't pay attention to managing those salaries appropriately, right? They give raises kind of here, there, and everywhere. They may hire an extra person and be overstaffed. They may forget to budget for promotions and those kinds of things. And all of a sudden, you're bleeding, a half point of gross margin here or there. You do it 4 or 5 or 6 times. All of a sudden, you're several points of gross margin down. Now, I'm also a fan of being a little bit overstaffed if that's what you want to do. I don't actually hate the idea of deliberately taking a little bit less gross margin to have an extra person around, but you have to do that deliberately. If that's a thing that you're going to do as a business owner or as a service manager, and that's like in the company budget, and it makes sense, and you keep your staff just a little bit less hectic, there's not a ton of downside there, unless you're looking to sell your business soon, right? If you're looking to exit your business, being overstaffed when you do that is probably not great for your valuation, probably also not great for on the back end, because someone's probably going to lose their job. So understand that if you are deliberately overstaffing and taking a little bit of a gross margin hit, and you're doing that on purpose, cool. If your gross margin is not great and you don't know why, and it's partially because you're paying your people too much, you have too many people, not cool, right? So you have to understand kind of where that money is going, and if you're doing it deliberately, I'm all about it. In addition to all these YouTube videos I create, I do have a newsletter that I try to release something new about once a month. You go ahead, and I'll drop the link in the description below and put it on the screen. But if you are interested in kind of hearing a little bit more from me on a relatively regular basis, please go ahead and subscribe. So then let's talk a little bit about being efficient and billing enough time and those kinds of things. So those are kind of where every MSP can really move the needle here, because oftentimes when I talk to MSPs, they either aren't tracking time very well, or they're not, and they're certainly not holding their teams accountable to it, and they're just kind of like billing whatever they bill and cool, moving on, right? And when you're a smaller MSP, probably not the end of the world, but as you grow, you get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 techs. The better you can keep an eye on kind of what's going on there, the better off you're going to be in the long run. So you need to understand what your techs are doing on a regular basis, not micromanaging, but paying attention to their billable time and making sure they're spending time effectively on things, and really making sure that they're billing an appropriate amount of hours. So when I talk to MSPs about like what their billable rate or utilization rate should be, oftentimes the idea is that it should be about 75%, which is pretty solid. But that 75% is really an annualized thing. I really think you want to be closer to 80, 85%. And the key here is that when you take into the additional vacation days and time that people have off, that actually kind of whittles the available pool of hours down on a daily basis. And so if everybody is 75% billable throughout the year on a daily basis, your actual billable rate, the annualized billable rate, is closer to 60-65%, which really does leave a fair amount of hours on the table. If you're going to aim at 80 or 85%, somewhere in there, that really means it's 6.5 hours of time billed per day per tech. Now here's the thing, is that if you tell your techs, hey, I need you to be billable between 80 and 85% per day, they're probably gonna go, cool, yep, I'll do what I can, and they're gonna go log their time and do whatever. But if you tell them, hey, I need you billing 6.5 hours a day, this is really important for us to be profitable, and if you want raises and those kind of things, like you can tell a little bit of a story there. If you give them the stat or give them the metric that's in a denomination or a metric that they understand and they know how to control, it's a whole lot better, right? I think back to when I was leading a really set of sharp project engineers, and I said, hey, I need you guys billing 85% of your time, and they went, yep, cool, we'll do it. And then it didn't happen. They were in that 60-70%. And then I'm like, hey guys, 85%, let's go. And they said, yep, cool, and then it didn't happen. Well, what it occurred to me that they hadn't done the math, and I didn't tell them what 80-85% meant. And so the next week I said, all right, guys, I need you to bill 6.5 hours a day. If you can bill 6.5 hours a day, everybody's happy. And they went, cool, we'll do that. And then it was magically at 85%. It was overnight, because I gave it to them in a metric that they could understand. Now, these were some of the smartest techs and people that I've worked with in my professional career, and they didn't do the math because they had other things on their mind. But the minute I gave them in a metric that they could understand and could easily control, a switch flipped, and things were in a much better spot. So make sure when you're talking to your techs about anything metric related, that it's in a mode, in a unit that they understand and know how to control. If you say, I need you to help me move gross margin up, and you don't give them any kind of guidance as to what gross margin is and how that happens and all the other pieces, expect a lot of blank stares and not a lot of help. But if you say, if we keep our billable rate at 85%, or at least 80%, if not close to 85%, which really means 6.5 hours a day, and that we're making sure that we're effectively using our time when we're doing things, you're going to be in a much better spot. But billing at 85% really isn't the full picture there either, much like the gross margin stat. Is the other piece is you need to be efficient with that time. You need your people to be working on the right things at the right time, right? So there's a couple little nuances that I want to call out. The first one is you do not want your level 1s working on level 3 work, and you don't want your level 3s working on level 1 work. That those two things should not happen. Meaning that someone needs to control kind of what people are working on to make sure that they're working on the appropriate stuff. If a level 3 is working on something that a level 1 could do, that's a poor use of their time, and you're paying that level 3 a fair amount of money that they could be spending on the bigger brain, higher billable projects and higher billable activities. If a level 1 is working on level 3 stuff, that's actually worse in my opinion, because a couple of things are going to happen. One, they're probably going to burn a bunch of time on it, which is not that efficient. And two, they might do it wrong or make things worse for you or for the clients. Both of those things can really be negatively impacting. So make sure that someone's paying attention to who's doing what, whether that's a triage person, whether that's a service coordinator, a service manager, team lead, project manager, whatever that role happens to look like in your MSP. And if you don't have that role, someone should be at least sort of paying attention to it. Getting the right people to do the right work is really important. The other piece about being efficient, and this is a bigger conversation around stack and documentation, but is doing the other pieces really well, right? Having good documentation standards, doing that part well, updating your documentation on a regular basis so that way things are as easy to follow as possible. Making sure that your tool stack is as consistent as possible so that you don't have one EDR for this set of clients and a different EDR for that set of clients, and one firewall for this one or two clients here, and then like two or three other ones. The more you can do to get your stack well aligned, and I'm not talking just hardware and software stuff either. I'm also thinking about your process stack, right? What does it look like to make a new user at client A versus client B? Are those two things different? Do you have 75 clients with 62 different ways of doing that? If that's the case, you really need to try to consolidate the processes that you're using to be your stack set of processes as well, because the easier you can make your tech's life to do their job well, the easier everything gets on the back end. So if you get your documentation figured out, you get your stack aligned and knocked out, and processes are aligned, those two things are really important. And the third thing is automation, or using some sort of automation tools, AI tools, and those kinds of things to make some of those repetitive tasks, the things that you do over and over again, a lot easier. The key here, there's a couple keys with automation, is one, is you need to spend some time on it. And if you are able to afford to have a person sort of dedicated to it, or spending a good chunk of their time on it, that where you can use tools like ImmuBot and Roost and some of those other things that are out there that will make your life a little bit easier by having a dedicated resource, awesome. I had a couple automation engineers at a previous MSP, and boy, they were worth their weight in gold, because they ended up saving so much time everywhere else for things like automating new user creation scripts and those kinds of things, where those rote daily tasks that took some time became a whole lot, one, easier and faster to do, and they actually created a lot less errors, because we removed a lot of the human element in the, did I check off all the boxes on the checklist, right? Not that everything could be automated, but we were able to automate a good chunk of it, so that way we didn't goof a new user setup and give them the wrong email address and have to have a bounce back ticket to go fix a stupid email thing, where we could have just done it right in the first place with a checklist or something. So when you build in these automation opportunities for your business and you do that well, it's great. One caveat with automation engineers, though, in my experience, you have to give them a target. You have to give them things to work on, because sometimes these techs are so smart and they want to tackle the biggest challenge. Well, sometimes the biggest challenge isn't the biggest ROI on that time, right? You might have an automation engineer trying to solve an issue with an installation for a line of business app that you do 3 times a year. Well, if that's going to save you an hour a year, kind of who cares, right? But if they could work on improving your new user creation script, and that's going to save you 10 hours a week, right? If maybe you're doing a lot of user creation, that's obviously where they need to spend their time. So someone needs to be paying attention to that. That's not them, because sometimes they will get down that rabbit trail and they'll be on it. And yes, they're using their big brain to do big brain stuff, but it's the return isn't there because they leaned into something that just wasn't that big of a deal for the overall sake of the organization. We talked about revenue. We talked about managing your COGS. We talked about being efficient and billable rate and those kind of things. The last thing to really get into is all around agreement efficiency. Making sure that your client fixed fee agreements are as efficient as possible from a pricing standpoint, right? So when you think about whether any particular agreement is profitable or not, you have to do some calculations on that. And the easiest way to kind of understand agreement efficiency is you take what you actually bill them for services, not all the cloud stuff and all that recurring cloud stuff, but it's really just the services, and divide that by what you would have billed them had there been time and materials. And that's going to give you a number. If the number is greater than 1, cool. If it's greater or less than 1, not so much, right? Especially if it's quite a bit less than 1, because what that's telling you is, it's telling you how efficient the agreement is, right? If that number is like 1.1, that means you're making $1.10 for every dollar, right? If the number is 0.9, that means you're making 90 cents for every dollar. Now, if you're within a standard deviation, if you're close to 1 on most cases, awesome. Ideally, though, you are 1.2, 1.3, somewhere in there, because it really says that you are using automation, documentation, and some of those things that we do on a regular basis for our MSP clients to make our agreement and time spent more efficiently, right? So the idea here is that if you can make that ratio be a little bit better than 1, you're doing pretty good. Now, there's a couple caveats here. Is like most of your clients are going to land somewhere in the middle, right? Somewhere in that 0.95 to 1.15 or something like that. But you're going to have some people that are way up on top and way on the bottom. There's a couple things to pay attention to there, right? The first thing is the folks on the bottom, right? The kind of the bottom feeders from agreement efficiency, if you will. Those bottom feeders you need to understand why those bottom feeders are there, and like why their agreements aren't as efficient as they could be, because there's oftentimes a project or a user that could do some training, some standards or some efficiencies could be gained for those clients that can move that ratio up a little bit. And that's usually where the projects come from and other things that you can do for your clients. On the flip side, that top set, those clients that are way too profitable, they are a potential flight risk because they may have already fired you, or they might just be thinking, hey, I haven't seen my MSP for a while. What's going on? I'm paying them a lot of money and I don't see a whole lot of love from them. So those folks, especially if they're your top, 5-10%, I might give them some extra love, right? Maybe stop in with pizzas at lunch or bagels for breakfast, or just stop by for a proactive visit, even just without bringing anything along. But just check in with them, be present a little bit. You're going to take a little bit of a hit on the agreement efficiency, but not enough to really move the needle downward. And you're going to keep that relationship going, right? You want to make sure that you're cultivating these relationships because, like I've said in a number of videos, this is a relationship business. We need to maintain and manage these relationships with our clients, especially with the ones who are heavily profitable, because you really don't want to lose those folks. So that's a really important thing to think about. There's a couple things that you can do to make this a little bit easier for you as well. There's a tool that you can use called MSP CFO. I don't typically make too many recommendations for tools in these videos. MSP CFO is one of those ones where I will happily make an exception because they are excellent. And they actually will automate a lot of this, especially if you happen to use one of the PSAs that they support, and they're always working on kind of making that tool set bigger. The other thing is build a spreadsheet, right? Take a spreadsheet and do this billable versus what you actually build versus what they would have paid if had been an hourly client, and pay attention to that. And it takes definitely some more legwork to do that, but it's certainly worth the time, especially if you're doing it on a regular basis. I will say that when I tasked my former account management team to manage this, right? Go and figure out why these clients are inefficient for whatever reason. We lifted a number of those clients up. And what happens is that clients will move up and then other ones will kind of move down because you're kind of, the rising tide raises all boats. And what you do is you kind of have this churn at you just call it bottom 15, bottom 20%, something like that. And you're always trying to make those clients who are less and less efficient more and more efficient, because that will make you a lot more money over time. And candidly, if you are able to do things like get the documentation in order and get their automation locked in and do those things that we need to do as MSPs, the client experience is going to be better. Your experience as an MSP with those particular clients is going to be better for you as well. And you're going to make more money. Like, everybody wins when you do this kind of work, right? So when you manage your overall gross margin and your service margins in particular, you're going to generate a whole lot more profit for your MSP. So get out there, manage your service margins, manage your margins overall. And when you do that, everybody wins. Two quick related videos I think are worth mentioning is the MSP Finance 101 type of video is going to be up over here, and pricing video is going to be up over here. Both those videos really will help you understand the financial side of the world with your MSP. Thanks for coming on this ramble with me, and hope to see you on the next one.